On a Monday morning in February of 2003, a man in suburban France got a phone call from a number that he recognized, so he answered it. But instead of the familiar voice he expected, all he heard on the other end was static and muffled voices somewhere in the background. He put his phone on speaker mode so his wife could listen, and the two of them listened closely to figure out, who's calling me? What is this? And as they listened, they were able to barely make out a conversation happening between two women who they didn't know. Afternoon of Friday, February 7th, 2003, a 52-year-old woman named Monique Lejeune cleared the table after lunch at her house in Cologne, France. Her husband, Claude, and two of her adult sons, Franck and Pascal, were at the table, and while Monique cleaned up, the men talked over what they needed to pack for the overnight trip they were about to take. They were heading to a family gathering near Paris, about 3.5 hours away, to celebrate Claude's sister-in-law's retirement. Monique was not going to go, and she had told her family it was because somebody had to stay home with their 4 dogs. And that was true, but there also was another real reason why Monique did not want to be there. And it was because she just didn't get along very well with Claude's family. So Monique and Claude had gotten married almost 20 years earlier, but at the time they both already had multiple kids from previous marriages. Monique had 3 boys, and Claude had 5 girls. And for a while, the two halves of the blended family had gotten along quite well. One of Claude's grandsons, so one of his daughter's children, had accused Monique's eldest son, Jean-Luc, of sexually abusing him, and that had completely ripped the family apart. Now, this was never reported to the police, so there was no actual investigation into whether this really happened or not. But Claude's 5 daughters and Claude's ex-wife Beatrice had fully believed the grandson, and Monique had defended her son, Jean-Luc, and Claude was kind of stuck in the middle of it. And it had gotten so ugly that the two sides watched as they hopped in the car and drove off. A few hours later, around 6:30 p.m., Monique heard a knock on the front door. And when she opened it, it was her son Jean-Luc, and he was standing there holding up his bicycle. He told his mom he was just stopping by on his way home from work. He was behind a baby gate at the base of the stairs and then fed them, and then she went into the kitchen and began cooking dinner for herself. But then, a little while later, at around 7:30 p.m., Monique heard another knock on the door, and she knew it very likely was not her son, and so as she walked down the hallway to answer it, she just hoped it wasn't Henri. From her second-floor window into the yard of the 2-story white house that was next door, Monique's house, and the neighbor saw there was something dark in the middle of the walkway that led to the front door of Monique's house. And so the neighbor, she put her face right up to the window and she squinted to get a better look. And she realized what she was seeing was a body lying face down on the pavement. And so in a panic, this woman ran. Monique opened the door and was attacked immediately. But then, as Prime stepped back outside, she looked down at the front walkway and noticed something kind of unusual. Despite all the blood right inside the front door, there was no blood at all on the walkway between the door and the spot where Monique's body was found. And just from the amount of blood that the victim had clearly lost inside the house, Prime doubted that she would have been capable of running out into the yard after the attack. So she had to wonder if maybe the body had been moved post-mortem. And Monique was a large woman. So if her killer had been able to overpower her, one, and then also move her body such a far distance after she was dead, Prime assumed that whoever her killer was likely pretty strong. In fact, Prime just kind of assumed that the killer had to be a big, strong man. However, asking her, what's going on? Where's Monique? What's happened? And she told them that unfortunately, Monique had been stabbed to death, and at first, all 3 of them just went completely silent. And then one of the sons, just began to cry. Prime then told them that they couldn't go into the house because it was still an active crime scene, so instead she led them over to the curb and they all sat down. Prime could tell the men were in shock because as much as one man was crying, it just seemed like they couldn't even process what they were told. But it was important to find out what Monique's family knew as soon as possible. So Prime pulled out a notepad and gently asked them about the last time they had seen Monique. The husband, Claude, said that they had all left the house around 3 p.m. the previous afternoon, pointed across the street at the house. A minute later, Prime was knocking on the front door of Henri's house, And after a few seconds, a middle-aged man answered the door, and he was very curious about what was going on across the street. And eventually, Prem told him that, well, your neighbor Monique has been murdered. And when she said that, Henri smiled. So immediately, alarm bells are going off in Prem's head. She's thinking this guy is very suspicious. And she asked him, like, can I come in and look around then? And Henri didn't even seem surprised by this request. It was like he already knew he was going to be looked at as a suspect and said, sure, come on in. So he stepped aside and Prem came in and began searching every room in the house, the living room, the kitchen, the upstairs bedrooms. But despite looking everywhere, she didn't find any traces of blood or really anything else suspicious or unusual. So eventually, Prem made her way back into the living room where Henri was waiting, and she asked him, where were you the previous evening? And he told her very casually that, well, he and his wife were home. They were here. Prem thought this was a pretty weak alibi, but she made a mental note to follow up with the wife and confirm it later. Next, Prem asked Henri if he had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary the night before. And Henri said no, except that maybe around 7 p.m., he had seen one of Monique's sons leaving her house on his bicycle. And at this, Prem perked up because the family heard him and she saw he had his flashlight out and he was pointing it at something on the wall. And when she got close enough, she could see that what he was highlighting were what appeared to be tiny drops of blood. And so Prem pulled out her flashlight and she too began scouring the walls and the floor near the stairs looking for any more blood. And she found a few more red droplets near the doorknob to a closet. And so she opened the closet up and inside was a bike. And she shined her flashlight on the bike, on the wheels and the frame, and she saw all these reddish-brown splatters all over the underside of it, as if whoever had ridden this bike last had basically drove through. He looked up as she entered, and he had this very scared and confused expression on his face. Prem sat down across from him and right away asked him what he had been doing at his mother's house on the night of February 7th. Jean-Luc said he had just stopped by after work, as he often did, and he only stayed for maybe half an hour before riding his bike back home. When Prem asked him if he had gone straight home afterwards, Jean-Luc said no, he hadn't. He explained that his wife's brother, Christophe Gressier, lived in the same apartment building as they did on the floor right below them. So before going up to his own unit, he said he just stopped by to chat with Christophe for a few minutes, and then after that, he spent the rest of the night in his own apartment with his wife. However, to Prem, she felt like there had to be more to this story because they had found what appeared to be droplets of blood sort of scattered throughout Jean-Luc's apartment, and then, there was blood, or at least what appeared to be blood, on the underside of his bike. And so she figured, maybe if she pushed hard enough, she might be able to get him to change his story. So she told him point blank they had found blood in his living room, and they were now sending it to the lab for analysis. And when Jean-Luc heard this, his face went bright red, and he began stammering that the blood was very likely from a neighbor who had injured himself while visiting a few days earlier. Prem nodded, but then told him, they'd also found blood sort of all over his bike. And Jean-Luc, he sort of hesitated and stuttered and stammered, but really couldn't come up with any way to explain that. At this point, Prem felt like she had Jean-Luc right where she wanted him. So she just told him to be quiet for a second and just roll up your sleeves so she could look at his arms. Prem knew, based on the defensive wounds on Monique's body, that she likely had fought back really hard, and she must have left at least a few scrapes or bruises on her killer. However, when Jean began writing, as the man explained that he was a co-worker of Christophe Gressier, and Prem immediately recognized that that was the name of Jean-Luc's brother-in-law, the one Jean-Luc said he had visited on the night Monique was killed. That was the person he saw apparently right after he left Monique's house. The man sitting across from Prem said that just a few hours ago, he'd gotten a call from Christophe's number. But when he answered it, all he could hear was a sort of muffled conversation between two women. And at first, this man thought what he was hearing was just an accidental call, maybe by Christophe's kid who was just pressing buttons at random. However, the man said when he put his phone on speaker, he and his wife, who was the woman he was with, they both started listening really closely, and they were able to make out a snippet of the conversation. The two women on the line were clearly talking about needing an alibi and saying something about a man named Jean-Luc. First, the women had said something like, "It's not Jean-Luc's." She put on a pair of latex gloves, and she reached inside the washing machine, and she pulled out a pair of pants that were still damp, as if they had just been washed earlier that day. And she held these pants up and kind of put them in the light, and she could see clearly there was a brownish stain on them. She also noticed that these pants looked like they'd be way too small for Christoph, who was a pretty tall and burly guy. But they definitely looked like they would fit a guy like Jean it was, and she was about to hang up when he told her to wait, because he had one more piece of news for her. He told her that during Monique's autopsy, the medical examiner had actually found DNA under Monique's fingernails, and it was very likely skin cells from her killer that had been scratched off during the struggle. The technician said it would take at least another few weeks to analyze it, but once the results came back, they could definitely test it against DNA samples from any of their suspects, and maybe it would be a match. This definitely, based on this revelatory DNA evidence and also an eventual confession by the killer, this is what police believe happened. The killer walked up to Monique's front door and knocked, and a few seconds later, the door opened and Monique was standing there. But instead of inviting the killer inside, Monique just kind of crossed her arms and stared. At this point, the killer began to speak. However, what was supposed to be a polite conversation quickly escalated into an argument, with both of them hurling insults back and forth. And then at some point, Monique slammed the door in the killer's face. But before she did, she said one last thing that was apparently so inflammatory that it pushed the killer over the edge. And so without even stopping to consider what they were doing, the killer, after having the door slammed in their face and hearing this totally inflammatory line, they stormed over to their vehicle, which was parked nearby, and they grabbed the knife they kept under their seat for self-defense. And they carried that knife right back to the front door and knocked again. And as soon as the door opened, the killer pushed their way inside, and with a surge of rage, they just started stabbing. But Monique was very strong and big, and she knocked the killer to the ground and actually pinned them there. But the killer managed to wrestle their arm free that was holding the knife. But Monique, she kept fighting back. I mean, this was an epic struggle. And also, the whole time this is happening, Monique's 4 dogs have basically come over to the gate, which butted up against the entryway, and they're watching this happen. And they're barking like mad, and Monique is screaming out in rage and panic and pain, until finally they were able to break away from Monique, who kind of had them pinned, despite, getting stabbed repeatedly. And then once the killer was free, they turned and bolted out of the house. The killer ran across the yard, got in their vehicle, began murder. It would turn out the killer was the 4-foot 9-inch tall, tiny, frail Beatrice Matisse, Claude's 58-year-old ex-wife, have overpowered Monique and then to have potentially moved her body out to the front yard. But it would turn out Monique's body was not moved at all. She stumbled out herself. Monique was apparently so full of adrenaline after getting attacked that she had managed to, chase Beatrice out of the house before she collapsed and died. And keep in mind, she did that after being stabbed over 50 times and losing an immense amount of blood inside. And because Monique had fought back so fiercely, she had managed to get traces of Beatrice's DNA under her fingernails. And so right away, the DNA analysis showed that their killer was a woman. And further testing eventually confirmed that it was a match for Beatrice on March 29, 2003, and she confessed to the murder immediately, although she later recanted the confession. In the late 1990s, in rural New York, there were these 2 teenage girls named Rachel and Molly, and they were both very good friends. They were part of a bigger group of friends in their high school that sort of spent a lot of time together, but Rachel and Molly oftentimes were together by themselves quite a bit. And the thing that sort of drew the 2 together, and Rachel was home alone when she got a call from Molly. And Molly asked her, hey, do you wanna go hang out in the cemetery? And Rachel's like, duh, that's what we do on the weekends, I'd love to go. Come pick me up, let's go. And so Rachel, she gets all ready and, she's waiting outside, and eventually Molly shows up in her car. And the first thing Rachel notices is that Molly's all alone in the car. She is not with the group that normally she would be with when they picked Rachel up. So Rachel, she walks out to the car and she climbs in and she says to Molly, hey, so are we now going to pick up the rest of our friends? Where is everybody?
And Molly's like, actually, no, I tried getting in touch with everybody else, but everybody's either busy or working or hungover from last night, so it's just going to be us two at the cemetery. Like, is that okay? And Rachel admittedly did not think this was okay. Because again, like, this was not an activity that these girls did by themselves. The cemetery was enormous. It was like this massive, very old cemetery. And when you pull up to it, as they did in their car, you would first see this huge, like, medieval gate, like this archway that sort of goes across the entrance to the cemetery. And like the big wrought iron gates, they're sort of permanently open, but it's this very, like, sort of Gothic looking, you know, archway that you drive through. And then once you're in the cemetery, the road you're on basically cuts down the very middle of the cemetery all the way to the backside. It's a huge, probably like over a mile from one side to the other. And it sort of split the cemetery into two big parts, the right and the left side as you go in. And where they, Molly, Rachel, and their friends loved to hang out was sort of as you're driving into the cemetery, like the back arc outside, and the girls are still just having a nice time. And Rachel's actually thinking to herself, like, actually, this is kind of nice. Like, this isn't scary. This is kind of cool. Like, I'm having, you know, good one-on-one time with my buddy here. But eventually, as they're down there, they start to smell smoke. Now, remember, periodically on the other side of the cemetery, like pretty far away, was that bonfire area that college kids sometimes would, you know, start bonfires over there. And, you know, when Rachel and Molly had first come into the cemetery, they had looked over there and hadn't seen a fire. But they're thinking, you know, we've been hanging out here for quite a while. It's entirely possible that in the time we've been down here, that those kids have hopped the fence, started a fire, and that's what we're smelling. Now, the fire itself really had no bearing directly on whatever Molly and Rachel were going to do that night. I mean, but as they walk up and they see their car and they look out across the cemetery, they don't see a fire over there. Instead, basically right over to their right, like, you know, 100 meters away from them, was another sort of depression in the cemetery, another rolling hill that sort of went down out of sight. And they could see basically the tops of a flickering fire, like in the neighboring depression, like 100 meters away. Now, when they showed up, they were definitely alone on this side of the cemetery. There was nobody else here. And so clearly someone has shown up and started a fire while they were here. And they've never seen any behavior like this. This is like completely unusual. Like, no one starts fires over here. Like, what is that? So the two girls they're curious. Like, did the college kids come over here to start a fire? Because again, they can only see the tops of the flames of this fire down in this neighboring depression. They can't see the person or people who are around her. Right as they got almost to the top, Rachel sort of unintentionally makes some noise, like the way she was walking, and she sort of made a sound as she stepped on something, but she accidentally makes a fair amount of noise. And the only noise in the area was the sound of the fire. Like, they hadn't heard any voices yet. And so Rachel, she just covers her mouth and looks over at Molly, and Molly kind of looked at her like, what are you doing? Like, we're sneaking up on these people. Like, why are you making noise? And the two girls, they just freeze for a second, waiting to see if, you know, whoever was over there heard them and sort of reacted to the noise Rachel made. But it was silent, sort of eerily silent. And at this point, Rachel and Molly, it was like the mood just shifted. Like, they had not reached the top of the hill yet. They had not seen whoever was at this fire. But it was like something just felt wrong now. And the two girls looked at each other and they're like, maybe we should just turn around and leave. And they both were like, yeah, let's get out of here. Like, this doesn't feel right. And so right then up, Rachel just happens to turn back around where they had just been, just to look in the direction of where they had just been. And now she sees there is clearly a man standing on the ridgeline with the fire behind him, illuminating him, and he's just standing there sort of ominously staring in the direction of Rachel and Molly. And he's just not saying a word, he's just looking in their direction. Clearly he was the one over at the fire. He must have heard them. And Rachel, she whips around and she's like, Molly, look. And Molly looks and she's like, let's get out of here. We don't know who that guy is. Like, we got to get out of here. And so Rachel and Molly, they begin quickly walking up the hill. And then a second later, Rachel turns back around and the man is no longer on the hill. But then she sees movement and she realizes he's running down the hill in their direction. And so the girls start screaming, they start running up the hill. Rachel's constantly looking around and this guy's gaining on them. They get to the top of the hill, they charge over to Molly's car, they jump inside, they lock the doors, they fire it up, and they drive off. And as they're driving, Rachel's looking out the back window and she sees this man basically looking. He's reached the road, like he almost got to them. And he was looking in their direction, and as they drove off, he just slowly turned and walked back down the kidnapped. And she got kidnapped from the very parking garage where I park. Like, she worked in the same building as me. She got kidnapped. And Rachel's like, oh my God, like, what happened to her? Like, did they find her? And Rachel's mom is like, no. Unfortunately, it was too late. When they found her, she was dead. And in fact, whoever kidnapped and then killed her brought her body last night to the local cemetery and burned her in this huge bonfire. And whoever did it still hasn't been caught. And when Rachel heard this, it was like her whole world came crashing down, because suddenly she understood what had happened the night before. That fire was no ordinary fire. That was the killer that chased them down the hill. That fire very likely contained the woman who had been killed. They were right next to this person, this killer, and this horrible thing happening. And even more creepy is, like, they were there very likely when the killer arrived, set up shop, and began burning this body, no more than 100 meters away from them. And what would have happened if that man who chased them, what would have happened if he caught them? And so police were able to catch this guy, and he would make a full confession. Luckily, 2 days later, not really because of the girl's description at all, but just sort of by luck alone, the police happened to see the victim's car in town. Somebody was driving the victim's car around, and so they pulled this person over. It wound up being the killer, who, after being arrested, did make a full confession. And so, needless to say, Rachel and Molly, when they think about what happened that night in the cemetery,